You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The job advertisement appeared on 3 different employment websites on the same day, which should have been my first clue that something was unusual. Night shift caregiver needed at Sunset Manor. Competitive pay, full health benefits, quiet work environment. Experience preferred, but not required. Must be comfortable working independently. The pay was almost double what similar positions offered elsewhere, and given my mounting student loan debt and the stack of overdue bills on my kitchen counter, I didn't spend much time questioning why. I'd been job hunting for 3 months since graduating with a degree in social work, watching my savings dwindle while I applied to position after position with little success. The economy was tough, and entry-level positions in my field were scarce. My roommate had already started making pointed comments about my share of the rent, and my parents' subtle suggestions that I move back home were becoming less subtle by the day. When I saw that salary figure, I immediately submitted my application, along with my resume, and a hastily written cover letter emphasizing my willingness to work nights, and my genuine desire to help elderly people live with dignity and comfort. The response came within hours, an email asking me to come in for an interview the next day. The speed of their reply should have been another warning sign, but I was too relieved at the prospect of steady income to pay attention to such details. Sunset Manor sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Columbia River Gorge, about 40 minutes outside of Portland. The drive up the winding mountain road took me through dense forests of Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even in the middle of the afternoon, the world below felt shrouded in perpetual twilight. The road itself was well maintained, but narrow, with frequent switchbacks that offered glimpses of the river far below, glinting like hammered silver through gaps in the foliage. The building itself materialized through the trees like something from a postcard, a sprawling structure of red brick and white trim, with wraparound porches dotted with rocking chairs, and hanging flower baskets bursting with autumn blooms. The architecture was distinctly Victorian, with ornate gingerbread trim and bay windows that caught and reflected the filtered sunlight. A circular driveway led to the main entrance, bordered by meticulously maintained gardens, where late-season roses still bloomed despite the October chill. Garden gnomes peeked out from behind carefully maintained rose bushes, their painted faces cheerful and welcoming. Wind chimes of various sizes hung from the porch eaves, creating a gentle symphony that seemed to harmonize with the sighing of the wind through the surrounding trees. American flags hung from several of the porch posts, and a hand-painted sign near the front entrance read, "Welcome to Sunset Manor, where every day is a gift," in cheerful yellow letters. A smaller sign below it listed visiting hours and included a phone number for inquiries. If not for the faint smell of sulfur that seemed to cling to everything, a scent I initially attributed to the geothermal activity common in the region, it could have been any retirement home in small-town Oregon. The sulfur smell was subtle, almost unnoticeable, unless you were paying attention, mixed as it was with the more pleasant aromas of pine sap, wood smoke from a distant chimney, and the lingering sweetness of the last autumn flowers. Mrs. Holloway met me at the front entrance exactly at 6 in the evening on a foggy Wednesday in October. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel grey hair pulled back in a tight bun that didn't allow for even a single strand to escape. Her eyes were the colour of storm clouds, sharp and intelligent, with laugh lines that suggested She wasn't always as serious as she appeared in that moment. She wore a navy blue cardigan over a crisp white blouse, and her handshake was firm, her smile polite but somehow guarded, as if she were constantly evaluating something about the people she met. "Welcome to Sunset Manor," she said, leading me through heavy double doors, made of dark wood with brass fixtures that gleamed despite their obvious age. The doors opened into a lobby decorated with floral wallpaper in soft pastels and landscape paintings that depicted serene countryside scenes. The furniture was traditional but comfortable looking. Overstuffed chairs in rich burgundy leather, side tables topped with fresh flower arrangements, and a large grandfather clock that ticked with reassuring regularity in one corner. The interior smelled of lavender air freshener, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and warm, like copper pennies left in the sun. There was also an underlying scent of age, the kind of smell that accumulates in buildings that have housed many lives over many years, composed of countless meals, conversations, moments of joy and sorrow layered one upon another until they become part of the very walls. "I trust you read through all the paperwork thoroughly?" Mrs. Holloway asked, as she led me past the reception desk where a younger woman with kind eyes smiled and waved. I nodded, though honestly most of it had been standard employment forms and liability waivers. Nothing about the residents themselves, which I'd found odd given that most care facilities provided detailed information about the population you'd be working with. There had been sections about emergency procedures, medication protocols, and confidentiality agreements, but nothing that seemed unusual for a facility of this type. "Excellent. Let me show you around, then we'll discuss your specific duties and responsibilities in detail." The tour began innocuously enough. We walked through a dining room with round tables covered in blue and white checkered tablecloths, each set for 6 with actual china plates and real silverware, rather than the disposable items I'd seen at other facilities. Fresh flowers adorned every table, and the walls were decorated with paintings of pastoral scenes and old photographs of the local area from decades past. Large windows looked out onto the gardens, and despite the gathering dusk, I could see bird feeders hanging from tree branches, surrounded by the flutter of small birds, taking advantage of the evening feeding time. From there we moved past a recreation room where several elderly people sat playing cards and watching an old western on a large television. The furniture here was arranged in conversation areas with comfortable sofas and chairs grouped around coffee tables stacked with magazines, books, and board games. A fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with family photographs and small decorative objects. The residents, I could see, appeared comfortable and content, chatting quietly among themselves or focusing on their card games with the intense concentration that seemed to come naturally to people who had learned to find joy in simple pleasures. The kitchen was spacious and well equipped, with industrial appliances that looked both professional and well maintained. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under bright fluorescent lights, and I could see through glass-fronted cabinets that were stocked with dishes, glassware, and serving pieces appropriate for a facility this size. A large walk-in pantry was visible through an open door, its shelves lined with enough supplies to feed a small army. The lingering aroma of dinner, something that smelled like roast beef and vegetables, still hung in the air, making my stomach rumble, despite the nervous energy that had been suppressing my appetite all day. We moved through a library lined with well-worn books, their spines showing the comfortable wear that comes from frequent handling. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling, and a rolling ladder provided access to the higher volumes. Comfortable reading chairs were scattered throughout the space, each with its own reading lamp and side table. I noticed that the selection was impressively diverse. Classic literature alongside contemporary fiction, history books, biographies, poetry collections, and even what appeared to be texts in languages I didn't recognize, their titles written in scripts that looked ancient and ornate. Past the library, we visited a small chapel with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows depicting peaceful pastoral scenes. The windows cast coloured light across the room, in patterns that shifted as the evening light outside grew dimmer. A small organ sat in one corner, and I could see hymnals and prayer books arranged neatly in the pew racks. The space felt genuinely peaceful, designed for quiet contemplation rather than elaborate ceremony. But as we ventured deeper into the facility, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit the typical retirement home pattern. The woman knitting in the corner chair near the library had needles that glowed faintly red at the tips, pulsing gently like tiny heartbeats. The yarn she worked with seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and when she pulled it from the basket beside her chair, it left brief trails of luminescence in the air, like sparklers on the 4th of July. When she noticed me looking, she smiled warmly and held up her work, a scarf that appeared to be knitted from what looked like spun gold thread, though that was surely impossible. The pattern she was creating seemed to shift and change as I watched, geometric designs flowing into organic shapes and back again. "That's Dorothy," Mrs. Holloway said quietly. "She's been with us for nearly 15 years. Quite the artist with those needles." An old man reading a newspaper by the window cast two distinct shadows, one normal, falling naturally across the floor in response to the reading lamp beside his chair, and another that moved independently across the wall behind him, sometimes gesturing expressively even when the man himself sat perfectly still. When he turned a page, both shadows turned pages, but not quite in sync, creating an odd doubling effect that made me blink and look twice. The independent shadow seemed to have its own personality, occasionally pointing at things in the room or waving at passing residents in a way that appeared both playful and somehow protective. Another resident, a frail-looking woman with wispy white hair, sat in the corner humming a melody that made the hair on my arm stand up and left me feeling inexplicably melancholy. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, with harmonies that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the air itself was providing accompaniment to her voice. Other residents nearby seemed to grow drowsy when she hummed, their eyelids growing heavy, their breathing deepening into the rhythm of peaceful sleep. One elderly man had actually dozed off in his chair, a peaceful smile on his face, and I noticed that his usually restless hands that had been fidgeting with the pages of his book, had gone completely still. "Our residents are very special," Mrs. Holloway said, noticing my confusion and the way my gaze kept returning to these unusual details. "They've led extraordinarily different lives than most people. They deserve peace and comfort in their golden years, don't you think? After everything they've experienced, everything they've been through, this is their time to rest." Before I could ask what she meant by extraordinarily different, we entered the art therapy room, where a thin man with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers was working at an easel. His canvas showed a landscape that shouldn't exist, twisted trees with silver bark that seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, under a sky the colour of dried blood that somehow conveyed both menace and beauty. In the distance, a city rose from rolling hills, and the buildings appeared to be constructed entirely from polished bone and black stone, their architecture following principles that hurt my eyes to contemplate for too long. Yet there was something hauntingly beautiful about the scene, a terrible majesty that drew the eye and held it captive. The more I looked, the more details I could see. Tiny figures moving through the Bone City streets, lights flickering in impossible windows, bridges that spanned gaps in ways that defied physics. It was as if the painting was a window into another world, one that existed parallel to our own, but operated by completely different rules. "That's Eugene," Mrs. Holloway said softly. "He's quite the artist. Eugene, this is our new night caregiver." Eugene looked up from his painting and smiled, his face crinkling with genuine warmth that immediately put me at ease. despite the disturbing nature of his artwork. Despite the otherworldly landscape he was creating, there was something immediately likable about him, a gentle quality that seemed to radiate from his very presence like warmth from a fireplace. His eyes, I noticed, had a faint, reddish tint that became more pronounced when the light hit them just right, but rather than seeming threatening, it gave him a distinguished, almost noble appearance. "Pleased to meet you," he said in a voice like autumn leaves rustling in the wind, with an accent I couldn't quite place, something that suggested he had travelled extensively and picked up linguistic influences from many different places. "Welcome to our little sanctuary. I hope you'll find your time here as peaceful as we have. It's rare to find a place where one can truly rest after a lifetime of various endeavours." That word, sanctuary, stuck with me as we continued the tour. Mrs. Holloway showed me the medical station with its locked cabinets full of medications, though I noticed that many of the prescription bottles had labels I couldn't read, written in what appeared to be Latin or perhaps some other ancient language. The supply closets were stocked with linens and cleaning materials, all of the highest quality, and I was surprised to see that even the most mundane items, towels, blankets, even the cleaning supplies, seemed to have an unusual quality to them, as if they were somehow more than they appeared. The staff break room contained a small kitchenette and comfortable chairs, along with a bulletin board covered with schedules, announcement, and what appeared to be genuine thank you notes from residents and their families. The employee handbook was thick and comprehensive, and I noticed that it contained several sections that seemed unusual for a typical care facility, chapters on cultural sensitivity for diverse backgrounds, and maintaining professional boundaries in unique circumstances. Mrs. Holloway explained the medication schedules in detail, walking me through a system that was more complex than I'd expected. Many residents, she explained, required very specific timing for their medications, and some had dietary restrictions that were quite unusual. She walked me through the emergency procedures, which included several protocols I'd never heard of before, and showed me the locations of all the important paperwork and contact information. "We also have a strict policy about documentation," she said, showing me filing cabinets that seemed to contain far more paperwork than a facility this size should require. Every interaction with residents must be logged, every unusual occurrence reported. We find it's better to err on the side of over-documentation rather than risk missing something important. Everything seemed normal and professional, if unusually thorough. The residents we encountered during the tour were polite and friendly, if occasionally unusual in small ways, that I attributed to the natural eccentricities that come with age and long life experience. The facility was clean and well maintained, with safety features and accessibility modifications appropriate for elderly residents. The staff-to-resident ratio was excellent, the documentation thorough, the atmosphere generally peaceful and welcoming. Then we reached the main corridor that connected the east and west wings of the building, and Mrs. Holloway stopped walking. Her expression grew serious, almost grave, and she turned to face me directly. The change in her demeanour was so sudden and pronounced that I felt my heart rate increase, though I couldn't have said exactly why. "There's something very important you need to understand," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "We have one rule here at Sunset Manor, just one. But it's absolutely critical that you follow it without exception, without question, without fail." I waited, expecting a list of regulations about medication protocols or safety procedures or documentation requirements. Perhaps something about maintaining professional boundaries, or procedures for handling emergency situations, or guidelines for interacting with residents who might have dementia or other cognitive issues. Never, under any circumstances, acknowledge their true names. I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "The residents go by human names now," she continued, her grip tightening slightly on my shoulder in a way that was somehow both reassuring and slightly uncomfortable. Dorothy, Frank, Eugene, Beatrice, Harold, Margaret. Common names, normal names, the kind of names you'd expect to find in any retirement community across America. If a resident tells you their real name, their original name, their birth name, their true name, whatever you want to call it, you must pretend you didn't hear it. Change the subject immediately. Walk away if necessary. Start talking about the weather. Ask about their dinner. Comment on their artwork. Anything to redirect the conversation, but never, ever repeat it back to them or acknowledge in any way that you heard it or understand its significance. I don't understand. Why would someone's name be... Because, she interrupted, her storm cloud eyes growing distant, as if she was seeing something far beyond the walls of the building around us. These residents chose to retire from their previous lives. They gave up their power, their titles, their old identities, their very nature in some cases, to live peacefully here. Using their true names would strip away that choice. It would force them back into what they were before, bind them to their original forms and duties, and that, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, would be catastrophic for everyone involved. The way she said it made my blood run cold. There was something in her tone that spoke of experience, of knowledge gained through terrible necessity, of consequences that were very real and very final. What exactly were they before? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, studying my face, as if trying to determine whether I could handle the truth she was about to reveal. Her eyes seemed to be weighing me, measuring my capacity for belief, my ability to accept something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Finally, she sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of years and secrets. Demons, ancient beings from the infernal realm who grew tired of their duties and chose a different path. Creatures of immense power who decided they wanted to experience peace, contentment, the simple pleasures of mortal existence. This place exists as their sanctuary, their refuge from the chaos and cruelty they once knew, but it only works as long as no one speaks the words that would bind them back to their original nature. I stared at her, waiting for the smile that would indicate this was some kind of elaborate prank or hazing ritual for new employees. Maybe this was their way of testing whether I could handle working with residents who had dementia or other conditions that might cause them to say unusual things. Maybe they were trying to see if I would maintain professional boundaries and avoid getting too emotionally involved with the people in my care. But her expression remained deadly serious, her eyes never wavering from mine. "I know how it sounds," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Believe me, I understand how impossible it must seem. When I first started working here 23 years ago, I reacted exactly the way you're reacting now. But you'll come to understand the truth of it soon enough. They're not evil, not anymore. They're not dangerous, as long as they remain as they are now. They're just very old souls who want to spend their remaining years in peace and quiet. Your job is to help them do exactly that. Can you handle this responsibility?" Looking back now, I realized that was the moment I should have thanked her politely and headed straight back to my car. Should have driven down that winding mountain road and never looked back. Should have chalked the whole thing up to an eccentric employer with some unusual residents and found work elsewhere, even if it meant moving back in with my parents and starting my job search all over again. Instead, I found myself nodding, partly because I needed the job so desperately, and partly because something in Mrs. Holloway's manner convinced me that she was absolutely serious about whatever she believed was true about this place. "Good," Mrs. Holloway said, her expression softening slightly. "Your shift officially starts at 8 tonight. I'll be here for your first week to help you adjust to our routines and get comfortable with the residents. After that, you'll be on your own during the overnight hours, but there's always someone on call if you need assistance. We have a very experienced day staff, and they're always willing to help if you have questions or concerns. The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and routine orientation tasks. I met Dorothy, the woman with the glowing knitting needles, who turned out to be a delightful conversationalist with strong opinions about everything from the weather to the current state of television programming. She had a slight accent that I couldn't place, something that suggested European origins but with influences I couldn't identify. She explained that she had once been involved in what she vaguely referred to as the hospitality industry in warmer climates, though she was always evasive about the specifics when I asked follow-up questions. Her knitting needles did indeed glow when she worked, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. The finished products, scarves, blankets, mittens, had an unusual warmth that seemed to come from within the fibres themselves, as if they were woven from captured sunlight or some form of energy that existed beyond normal understanding. When she gave me a small pair of mittens to keep your hands warm during the night shift, I was amazed at how perfectly they fit and how they seemed to radiate comfort in a way that went beyond mere physical warmth. Frank turned out to be the man with the independent shadow. He was gruff but not unkind, a former resident of what he called downtown in the old neighborhood, who now spent most of his time working crossword puzzles and complaining about the cafeteria's coffee. His knowledge of obscure words and references was encyclopedic, and he completed puzzles that would have stumped most people in minutes. His shadow was endlessly entertaining to watch, often gesturing expressively or pointing at things even when Frank himself sat perfectly still. Sometimes the shadow would wave at other residents, or tap its foot to music that Frank claimed not to hear, or point toward things that needed attention before anyone else had noticed them. "Been like that since I retired," Frank explained when he caught me staring at the wall behind him. "Used to be more coordinated, you might say. Now it's got a mind of its own. Keeps me company, though. Sometimes I think it sees things I miss." Beatrice was the woman whose humming had affected me so strangely during the tour. She had been, she explained with a mysterious smile that held hints of secrets I couldn't begin to imagine, in the music business for a very long time. Her voice, even in normal conversation, had an odd quality that made you want to keep listening, to lean closer, to hang on every word. There were harmonics in it that shouldn't exist in human vocal cords, undertones and overtones that created a richness of sound that was almost hypnotic. When she sang lullabies to residents who had trouble sleeping, the songs worked better than any medication, sending even the most restless souls into deep, peaceful slumber. She had an extensive repertoire that seemed to draw from musical traditions spanning centuries and cultures, and sometimes she sang in languages that sounded ancient and beautiful, even though I couldn't understand the words. Harold was a quiet man who spent most of his time in the garden behind the building, tending to plants that seemed to grow with unusual vigor under his care. The vegetables he grew were larger, more flavorful than they had any right to be, and flowers bloomed out of season under his gentle touch. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always with kindness and wisdom that suggested he had seen much of the world and learned from the experience. He used to work with agriculture, he told me when I asked about his obvious expertise with plants. Different kind of farming than most folks are used to, but the principles are the same. You treat the earth with respect, and it gives you what you need. His hands, I noticed, had an unusual quality to them. When he touched a wilting plant, it would perk up almost immediately. Seeds he planted seemed to germinate overnight, and I watched him coax blooms from stems that looked completely dead. The other residents often came to him with requests for specific herbs or flowers, and he always seemed to have exactly what they needed. Margaret was perhaps the most obviously unusual of the residents. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she moved with a grace and precision that suggested hidden strength and capabilities far beyond what her elderly appearance might suggest. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing, and she had an uncanny ability to appear wherever she was needed most, often before anyone realized they needed help. Residents would mention being worried about something, a lost item, a nagging pain, a problem with their room, and Margaret would materialize with exactly the right solution. She seemed to have an unlimited supply of useful items in her room, and I quickly learned that if anything went missing in the facility, Margaret was the person to ask. She always knew where to find it or had a replacement readily available. "Been here longer than most," she explained when I commented on her helpful nature. "You learn to anticipate needs when you've been looking after people for as long as I have. Used to be in customer service, you might say. Different clientele than we have here, but the skills transfer." And then there was Eugene, who quickly became my favourite among all the residents. Despite the disturbing beauty of his artwork, he was gentle and thoughtful, always asking about my day and remembering small details about my life outside the facility. He had an endless supply of stories about travelling the world, though he was always vague about when these travels had occurred and in what capacity he had undertaken them. The way he described places made them come alive in my imagination. Cities I'd never heard of, landscapes that sounded too beautiful to be real, cultures and customs that seemed to belong to different eras entirely. His paintings grew more elaborate each day, forests of silver trees under impossible skies, mountains that seemed to breathe with their own life, oceans the colour of liquid starlight stretching toward horizons that curved in ways that defied geometry. Each canvas was a masterpiece that belonged in a museum, yet he treated them as casual exercises, often giving them away to other residents or staff members who admired them. "I miss it sometimes," he confided one evening, about a week into my employment, as I helped him clean his brushes after the day's art therapy session. The art room was quiet, filled with the peaceful atmosphere that comes after creative work has been completed. The old life, I mean. There was a certain grandeur to it all. The scope of it, the scale, the sense of purpose, even if that purpose was sometimes... He paused, searching for the right words while examining his paint-stained fingers. "Well, let's just say it was different from painting watercolours and playing checkers." He held up his arthritic hands, studying the paint stains on his fingers with a mixture of affection and melancholy. "But these hands create beauty now instead of..." He trailed off, then smiled with a warmth that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Well, instead of other things. Perhaps that's a fair trade. Perhaps it's even a better trade than I deserve to make." There was something in the way he said it that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't quite grasp, as if his words carried the weight of experiences and choices that stretched far beyond anything I could imagine. The work itself was easier than I had expected. The residents were remarkably well-behaved and self-sufficient, requiring minimal assistance with daily activities. My duties mostly involved helping with evening medications, doing hourly wellness checks throughout the night, being available in case of emergencies and providing companionship to anyone who had trouble sleeping or felt anxious during the dark hours. The strangest part was getting used to the small supernatural quirks that seemed to be part of daily life at Sunset Manor. Dorothy's knitting needles would spark and smoke when she got excited about a particularly complex pattern, sending tiny showers of harmless sparks across her work area. Frank's shadow would occasionally wave at me from across the room or point toward residents who needed attention before I had noticed anything was wrong. Beatrice's humming could put even the most restless resident to sleep within minutes, and sometimes I caught myself growing drowsy just from being in the same room when she practiced her scales. Harold's plants in the garden grew at visible rates, unfurling new leaves and blooms even as you watched. I would sometimes sit with him in the garden during quiet moments, watching in fascination as he coaxed life from seemingly dead soil. Margaret had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs, appearing with a warm blanket just as someone began to feel cold, bringing exactly the right book to someone who was bored, somehow always knowing when a resident was feeling lonely or confused. But these quirks never felt threatening or dangerous. They were simply part of the unique character of the place, like the way some buildings settle with distinctive creaks, or how certain neighborhoods develop their own particular atmosphere over time. The residents themselves seemed to take these unusual abilities for granted, as if they were as natural as breathing or walking. After 2 weeks, I had begun to think of Sunset Manor as just another job with some unusual perks. The residents seemed genuinely happy, spending their days in quiet pursuits and comfortable routines. They played cards and board games, with Dorothy usually winning at poker through what she claimed was intuition, but which seemed to involve an uncanny ability to read people's intentions. They tended to Harold's garden, helped with simple cooking tasks in the kitchen, held book club meetings in the library, where they discussed literature with insights that suggested they had personally known some of the authors they were reading. They participated in various craft activities organised by the day staff, creating works of art that were far more sophisticated than typical retirement home projects. They watched old movies together in the recreation room, though I noticed they often made comments that suggested they had been present during the time periods the films depicted. They shared meals in the dining room, where the conversations were lively and wide-ranging, covering topics from current events to historical periods to philosophical questions that would have challenged university professors. In the evenings, they would sit on the porches, wrapped in Dorothy's impossibly warm blankets, watching the sunset paint the gorge below in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes Beatrice would sing, her voice carrying across the landscape in ways that seemed to make the very air shimmer with harmonies. Other residents would join in, creating music that was hauntingly beautiful and somehow timeless. If not for the occasional supernatural occurrence, and Mrs. Holloway's strange warning about names, it could have been any retirement community anywhere in the country. The residents had formed friendships and routine social groups. They looked out for each other, celebrated birthdays and holidays together, mourned the occasional loss when someone passed away peacefully in their sleep, though I noticed that deaths were surprisingly rare at Sunset Manor, and when they did occur, they seemed to be more of a transition than an ending. I'd even grown comfortable enough to share some of my own stories with them. Eugene was particularly interested in my college experiences, asking thoughtful questions about my studies and my plans for the future that showed he understood the challenges facing young people in the modern world. Dorothy wanted to hear about my family, nodding approvingly when I described my younger sister's recent engagement and offering advice about relationships that was surprisingly insightful. Frank enjoyed debating current events, though his knowledge of world affairs seemed oddly comprehensive for someone who claimed to have lived a quiet life, and he often made references to historical events as if he had been personally present for them. The other staff members were friendly and professional, though I noticed they all seemed to have been working at Sunset Manor for unusually long periods of time. When I asked Mrs. Holloway about staff turnover, she explained that people who worked well at the facility tended to stay for many years, finding the environment both rewarding and peaceful. Those who didn't work out, she said with a slight frown, usually left very quickly during their initial training period. I should have known that such contentment was too good to last. The change began subtly during my 3rd week at the facility. It started with dreams, not nightmares exactly, but vivid, strange dreams that lingered long after I woke up. I dreamed of vast cities built from black stone and polished bone, their spires reaching towards skies that burned with colours that had no names. I dreamed of forests where the trees whispered secrets in languages I almost but not quite understood, their voices carrying the weight of ancient knowledge that seemed just beyond my grasp. The landscapes in these dreams were impossibly beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I would find myself walking through valleys where the grass grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly, or climbing mountains that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the 3 I was familiar with. Sometimes I would see figures in the distance, beings of terrible beauty and power who moved with purpose and grace through environments that defied every law of physics I had ever learned. The dreams themselves weren't frightening in any conventional sense, but they left me feeling unsettled, as if I had been somewhere I wasn't supposed to go and seen things I wasn't supposed to see. I began waking up with the taste of sulphur in my mouth and the sound of distant music echoing in my ears. Complex, beautiful melodies that seemed to be played on instruments that didn't exist in the waking world. The music was hauntingly beautiful, with harmonies that suggested mathematical principles I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. During my shifts, I started noticing things I had previously overlooked. The way certain residents would pause in their conversations when I entered a room, as if they had been discussing something I wasn't meant to hear. The way their eyes would sometimes flicker with colours that weren't quite natural. Not the warm, red glow I had grown accustomed to, but deeper shades that seemed to contain entire worlds of experience and knowledge. I began to catch fragments of conversations in languages I didn't recognise, though somehow I could almost understand them. Words that seemed to carry weight beyond their sound, that made the air itself feel thicker and more charged with potential energy. Sometimes I would hear names being mentioned, not the human names the residents used in daily conversation, but other names that seemed to resonate with power and meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Eugene's paintings, too, began to change. The landscapes he created grew more detailed, more realistic in their impossible beauty. I could see movement in the painted trees, as if a wind was blowing through branches that existed only on canvas. The cities in his background seemed to have lights flickering in their windows, and sometimes I could swear I heard the distant sound of activity, voices, music, the general hum of life, coming from the painted scenes. The colours he used became more vivid, more intense, creating effects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. His brushwork became more confident, more precise, as if he was remembering techniques he had once known but had forgotten during his years of retirement. The paintings began to take on a quality that was almost three-dimensional, as if they were windows into other worlds, rather than simple artistic representations. "You're becoming more sensitive," he observed one evening, as I stood transfixed by his latest work, a panoramic view of a valley filled with structures that defied architectural logic. The buildings seemed to shift and change as I watched, their geometry flowing like liquid while somehow maintaining their essential structure. It happens sometimes to people who spend enough time around us. The barriers between worlds become thinner. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Eugene set down his brush and studied me with those kind eyes that sometimes seemed far older than his elderly face suggested. In the art room's soft lighting, I could see that his eyes weren't just tinged with red. They contained depths that seemed to go on forever, as if I was looking into spaces that existed far beyond the physical world. "We carry traces of where we came from," he said carefully, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing information that was both precious and dangerous, echoes of our former existence. Most humans can't perceive those echoes, but some are more attuned to the spaces between worlds. "It's not dangerous," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Just expanded awareness. You're seeing things as they truly are, rather than as they appear to be." That night I found it difficult to concentrate on my rounds. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be, every sound more significant. I caught myself pausing outside residents' doors, listening to conversations that seemed to be taking place in multiple languages simultaneously. The building itself felt different, larger somehow, as if the hallways stretched farther than they should, as if rooms contained more space than their dimensions allowed. The next few days brought more changes. I began to notice patterns in the residents' behaviour that I had missed before. They moved through the facility with a purpose and coordination that suggested they were following routines and protocols that went far beyond the simple daily schedules posted on the bulletin boards. They would gather in small groups for conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, their eyes following me with an intensity that wasn't quite suspicious but wasn't entirely casual either. Margaret, in particular, seemed to be watching me more closely. I would catch her studying me from across rooms, her sharp eyes tracking my movements with the focus of someone conducting a careful evaluation. When I asked her about it directly, she simply smiled and said she was keeping an eye on things. But her tone suggested layers of meaning I couldn't penetrate. Frank's shadow had become more active as well, pointing out things that seemed significant but which I couldn't interpret. It would gesture toward particular residents at specific times, or indicate areas of the building that I should pay attention to, or point at paintings and decorations that seemed to contain hidden messages I couldn't decode. Dorothy's knitting had taken on new complexity, her needles creating patterns that seemed to shift and change even as I watched her work. The items she produced had become more elaborate, incorporating designs that looked like they belonged in museums rather than in a retirement home craft room. She offered to teach me some of her techniques, but when I tried to follow her instructions, my fingers couldn't seem to manage the movements she made look effortless. Harold's garden had exploded into a riot of growth that defied both season and climate. Plants that shouldn't exist in Oregon were thriving in his carefully tended beds, producing fruits and flowers that I'd never seen before. The vegetables he harvested were not just larger than normal. They were perfect in ways that seemed almost supernatural, without blemishes or imperfections of any kind. When I asked him about his techniques, he just smiled and said it was a matter of understanding what things really need to grow. Beatrice had begun including me in some of her musical activities, teaching me songs that seemed simple at first but revealed layers of complexity the more I listened to them. Her voice had an effect on me that grew stronger each day, leaving me feeling peaceful and content in ways that lasted for hours after our sessions ended. Sometimes I would catch myself humming melodies she had taught me, only to realize that the sounds coming from my throat were far more complex than anything I should have been able to produce. It was during this period of gradual change that I began to understand why Mrs. Holloway had been so insistent about the importance of following the one rule. I started to see that the residents' human names weren't just convenient aliases. They were somehow fundamental to maintaining the peaceful existence they had created for themselves. The names were like anchors, keeping them tethered to their chosen identities and preventing them from slipping back into whatever they had been before. I noticed that when residents spoke to each other, they were very careful about how they addressed one another. They used first names consistently, often adding terms of endearment or friendship that reinforced the human connections they had built. They never used titles or formal addresses that might hint at previous positions or roles they had held. In group conversations, they would gently redirect anyone who seemed to be on the verge of revealing too much about their past. The facility itself seemed to be designed to support this careful balance. The decorations, the activities, the daily routines, everything was crafted to reinforce the image of a normal retirement community where ordinary people lived out to their golden years in comfort and peace. Yet, underneath that surface normalcy, I began to sense the presence of something far more complex and purposeful. During my 4th week, the dreams became more intense and frequent. I found myself visiting the same impossible landscapes night after night, each time exploring deeper into territories that seemed to exist in dimensions my waking mind couldn't fully comprehend. The cities I walked through in these dreams were populated by beings that I knew somehow were the true forms of the gentle elderly people I cared for during my waking hours. I saw Dorothy as she once was, a figure of terrible beauty and power, commanding legions of servants in halls that stretched beyond the horizon. I watched Frank moving through shadows that obeyed his will, bending reality to his purposes with casual gestures, I witnessed Beatrice conducting choirs of voices that could reshape the very fabric of existence with their harmonies. And Eugene, in my dreams, I saw him as he truly was, a being of such magnificence and authority that my sleeping mind could barely process his presence. He stood atop towers that pierced multiple layers of reality, directing activities that spanned worlds and dimensions. His power so vast that it made the forces of nature seem like gentle breezes in comparison. Yet, even in these dreams, there was something melancholy about these visions of power and glory. The beings I saw seemed weary, burdened by responsibilities that had grown heavy over eons of existence. In their eyes, I could see the longing for peace that had driven them to give up everything they once were, in exchange for the simple pleasures of mortal existence. When I woke from these dreams, I would find myself with tears on my cheeks, though I couldn't say whether they were from sadness or joy, or some emotion that had no name in human language. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur, and I started to see traces of the dream world bleeding into my daily experience at Sunset Manor. The paintings on the walls seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The garden flowers Harold tended would sometimes glow within a light during the darkest hours of the night. The books in the library would fall open to pages written in languages that shifted and changed as I tried to read them. The very air in the building seemed to hum with energy that my increasingly sensitive perception could detect but not quite understand. Mrs. Holloway noticed the changes in me during our weekly check-in meetings. She would study my face with the careful attention of someone monitoring a delicate process, asking questions about my sleep, my dreams, my general state of mind. Her questions were always casual, seemingly part of normal supervisory concern, but I began to realize she was tracking something specific in my responses. It's natural, she assured me, when I mentioned feeling more aware of unusual details around the facility. People who work here for any length of time develop enhanced sensitivity. It's nothing to worry about as long as you remember the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. She emphasized the last part with particular care, reminding me once again about the single rule that governed everything at Sunset Manor. Her warnings had taken on new urgency as my awareness increased, and I began to understand that the rule wasn't just about protecting the residents. It was about protecting people like me from consequences I was only beginning to glimpse. It was on a Friday night during my 4th week that everything finally came to a head. I was making my final rounds before settling in for the quieter overnight hours, checking on each resident to ensure they were comfortable and safe for the night. Most were already asleep, their rooms quiet except for the gentle sounds of peaceful breathing. But when I reached Eugene's room, I heard sounds that immediately set my nerves on edge. Thrashing movements, muttering, what sounded like words in a language that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to some deeper part of my consciousness. The sounds were distressing not just because they indicated Eugene was having a nightmare, but because they carried an undertone of power that made the air itself feel charged and dangerous. I knocked softly on his door and, receiving no answer, eased it open to check on him. The scene that greeted me was unlike anything I had experienced during my time at the facility. Eugene was in the grips of what appeared to be a terrible nightmare, but the physical manifestations were far beyond anything I had ever seen. His thin frame was rigid with tension, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had gone white, and I could see his fingernails drawing blood from his palms. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room, and his breathing was rapid and shallow, each exhalation carrying a sound like distant thunder. The muttering grew louder as I approached, harsh, guttural sounds that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with barely contained energy. The words, if they were words, carried power that I could feel pressing against my consciousness like a physical force. They seemed to be calling out, reaching towards something or someone across vast distances of space and time. The temperature in the room felt wrong, too warm despite the air conditioning that kept the rest of the facility comfortable. There was a smell like hot metal and burning stone, mixed with that familiar sulfur scent but concentrated to an almost overwhelming degree. The shadows on the walls seemed to move independently of any light source, writhing and twisting, as if they were alive and responding to the sounds Eugene was making. I approached his bed carefully, intending to wake him gently, as I had been trained to do with any resident experiencing nightmares. The facility's protocols were clear about maintaining resident dignity and safety during vulnerable moments, and I had successfully helped several other residents through similar episodes during my time there. But as I reached out to touch his shoulder, Eugene's eyes snapped open with an intensity that made me gasp and take an involuntary step backward. They weren't the usual dim red I had grown accustomed to seeing in many of the residents. They blazed like twin furnaces, casting dancing light across the walls and ceiling with such intensity that I had to squint and turn my head slightly to avoid being temporarily blinded. The light they cast wasn't the warm, steady glow of fire, but something far more complex. Colours that shifted and changed, creating patterns that seemed to carry meaning I couldn't understand, but felt compelled to try to decipher. When he spoke, his voice was completely different, deeper, more resonant, like the sound of grinding stone, mixed with the roar of distant thunder. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in my bones and making the windows rattle in their frames. "Malthus," he said, and the words seemed to echo not just in the room, but in dimensions I couldn't see, carrying across spaces that existed beyond normal reality. Builder of towers, commander of 40 legions, keeper of the flame eternal, he who builds citadels in the spaces between stars. I froze completely, every muscle in my body going rigid, as the implications of what I had just heard crashed over me like a wave. This had to be his true name, the one Mrs. Holloway had warned me about so urgently during my first day. I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. Ignore it completely, change the subject, pretend I hadn't heard anything at all. Walk away if necessary. Leave the room, get help from the day staff if the nightmare continued. But Eugene looked so distressed, so lost and vulnerable, despite the power that suddenly radiated from him like heat from a forge. His blazing eyes were filled with confusion and fear, and something that looked like desperate longing. This gentle man who painted beautiful impossibilities and asked about my day and worried about whether the birds in his latest landscape looked realistic enough. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own past, reliving experiences that had driven him to seek refuge in this quiet sanctuary. I could see the conflict in his expression, the struggle between the peaceful existence he had chosen and the ancient power that was trying to reassert itself. His face showed the pain of someone being torn between two different versions of himself, unable to fully embrace either one. The air in the room continued to heat up, and I could see energy crackling around his form. Like barely visible lightning, the shadows on the walls writhed more frantically, and I heard what sounded like distant voices calling out in that same incomprehensible language. Other sounds began to filter in, the sound of vast wings beating, of stone grinding against stone, of fires burning in places that existed far beyond the physical world. Without thinking, driven by compassion and concern for someone I had come to care about deeply, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. The moment my skin made contact with his, I felt a jolt of energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating, a connection that seemed to bridge the gap between his current peaceful existence and the vast power he had once wielded. "It's okay, Malthus," I said softly, the name feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. "You're safe here. The nightmare is over." The moment his true name left my lips, everything changed in ways I could never have imagined. Eugene's body began to transform before my eyes, the process both beautiful and terrifying to witness. His frail frame expanded rapidly, muscles swelling beneath skin that darkened from pale pink to charcoal grey, then to a deep black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His sparse white hair thickened and darkened to midnight black, growing longer until it fell past his shoulders in waves that moved as if stirred by an invisible wind. The wrinkles around his eyes smoothed away like water flowing uphill, revealing sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of nobility and ancient authority. His thin shoulders broadened dramatically, and with a sound like tearing fabric mixed with the snap of unfurling sails, massive wings burst from his back, shredding his pajama top and spreading wide enough to span the entire width of the room. The wings were magnificent and terrible, covered in feathers that looked like they had been forged from black steel and polished obsidian, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. The symbols glowed within a fire, creating patterns that suggested vast libraries of knowledge and power that existed beyond human comprehension. The wings moved with their own life, casting shadows that danced across the walls, in patterns that suggested vast cities and impossible architectures. His transformation wasn't just physical. The very air around him changed, becoming thick with power and potential. I could feel forces gathering that existed beyond normal reality, energies that connected to realms and dimensions I couldn't even imagine. The temperature continued to rise, but it wasn't just heat. It was the presence of something vast and ancient, awakening from a long sleep. But it was his eyes that affected me most profoundly. They still held that same gentle kindness I had come to know and appreciate during our many conversations. But now it was mixed with an ancient sadness that seemed to encompass millennia of experience, and something that looked unmistakably like gratitude mixed with profound regret. "Oh," he said, and his voice was now a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in my bones and making the windows rattle in their frames. The sound carried harmonics that spoke of power beyond measure, but also of loss and longing that cut through me like a blade. "Oh, my dear friend, my kind, compassionate friend, what have you done?" I tried to step back but found that I couldn't move. The air around me had become thick and viscous, like trying to move through honey that was rapidly heating toward the boiling point. My skin began to tingle, then burn, as if I was standing too close to an enormous fire that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. "I'm sorry," I managed to whisper, though speaking required tremendous effort as the superheated air scorched my throat and lungs. Malthus, I couldn't think of him as Eugene anymore, though part of me desperately wanted to, rose from the bed with fluid grace despite his enormous size. He was at least 7 feet tall now, with wings that spanned nearly 15 feet when fully extended. Despite his obvious power and the supernatural energy that rolled off him in visible waves, he moved with careful precision, as if afraid he might accidentally cause more damage than was already inevitable. "You freed me from my choice," he said, his voice filled with profound sadness that seemed to contain the weight of ages. "I am bound by the old laws now, the ancient compacts that govern the nature of what I truly am. I must return to what I was, to where I came from, to the duties I sought to abandon. And you?" He paused, genuine anguish flickering in those blazing eyes. "You have seen my true form and spoken my name with understanding and recognition. The contract of this place, the sanctuary that protects both us and the mortal world, is broken for you." I could hear footsteps running down the hallway. Mrs. Holloway, probably alerted by some kind of supernatural alarm system I hadn't known existed, but I could tell she wouldn't reach us in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. The sounds of her approach seemed to come from very far away, as if the space between Eugene's room and the rest of the facility had somehow expanded beyond normal dimensions. The air around me continued to heat up at an alarming rate. My skin began to blister and peel, not from fire, but from exposure to energies that mortal flesh was never meant to encounter. I could smell sulfur now, thick and choking, mixed with something else, the scent of ash and molten metal and spaces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. "I'm so sorry," Malthus said again, and I could hear genuine anguish in his voice, the pain of someone forced to harm a friend against their will. "You were kind to an old demon, trying to forget what he was and what he had done. So few humans ever showed me such simple compassion, such uncomplicated friendship. I will remember your kindness even when I am forced to return to cruelty." He spread his wings to their full, magnificent span, preparing for whatever transformation or transportation would take him back to his original realm and duties. The heat intensified dramatically, and I felt my body beginning to break down at the cellular level, my very essence being pulled toward energies and dimensions that existed far beyond the safe boundaries of mortal existence. The rule wasn't just to protect us from being forced back into our old forms, Malthus explained as my consciousness began to fragment under the assault of otherworldly forces. It was to protect humans like you from the consequences of bridging the gap between worlds. Speaking a demon's true name creates a connection, a bond that links the speaker to our realm. And mortals, no matter how brave or compassionate, cannot survive in the spaces between worlds where such connections must inevitably lead. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of sorrow and resignation. She didn't try to enter the room. She couldn't, I realized. Whatever was happening to me had created a barrier of infernal energy that even someone with her obvious knowledge and experience couldn't breach. The doorway itself seemed to ripple and distort, as if reality was bending around the forces that were being unleashed. "I told you," she said quietly, though I could barely hear her over the roaring sound that filled my ears like the approach of a cosmic storm. "I told you there was only one rule. I told you why it existed. I told you the consequences would be catastrophic." But there was no anger in her voice, only sadness and the weary resignation of someone who had witnessed this tragedy before. In her eyes, I could see the pain of someone who had tried to prevent exactly this outcome, who had done everything in her power to prepare me for the dangers I would face. Behind her, I could see other figures gathering, the residents I had come to know and care for, drawn by the supernatural disturbance. Dorothy stood with tears streaming down her face, her knitting abandoned as she watched the scene unfold. Frank's shadow had separated completely from his body and was pressing against the barrier, trying desperately to reach me. Beatrice was singing something in a language I didn't recognize, her voice carrying notes of mourning and farewell. Harold had brought flowers from his garden, impossible blooms that glowed with inner light, and was scattering them at the threshold as if creating some kind of memorial. Margaret stood perfectly still, her sharp eyes recording every detail of what was happening, as if she were documenting the event for some purpose I couldn't understand. The last thing I saw was Malthus bowing his great head in my direction, a gesture of profound respect and farewell. His wings began to glow with inner fire, and I could see other figures materializing in the shadows behind him, beings of similar power and terrible beauty, come to escort their colleague back to whatever realm or duty he had sought to escape. Then the darkness claimed me completely, pulling me down through layers of reality I'd never imagined existed, into spaces that were neither entirely physical nor entirely spiritual, where the rules that governed mortal existence held no meaning or power. I suppose they found another night shift worker eventually. The job posting probably appeared on the same employment websites, offering the same generous pay and benefits, attracting someone else who needed the money and didn't ask too many questions about why the compensation was so unusually high. I hope Mrs. Holloway explained the rule more clearly to my replacement. I hope she emphasized not just what not to do, but why the restriction existed, What forces were held in check by that simple prohibition? I hope the new caregiver listened more carefully than I did, paid better attention to the warnings, understood that some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend human comprehension. Because there really is only one rule at Sunset Manor, just one simple instruction that stands between peaceful coexistence and catastrophic disaster, and it exists for a very, very good reason.